Welcome, seventh graders, to the Dallas Environmental Education Center. Welcome to the Young Men's Leadership Academy at Fred Florence Middle School. Thank you so much for registering for today's field trip, and we look forward to working with you this morning. If you have not registered for today's field trip yet, you can still do that by going to www.tiny.cc/EEC register to get yourself or your class registered for this field trip. This morning, we are going to explore cell structure and function. So during this virtual field trip, students will discover that living systems at all levels of organization demonstrate the complementary nature of structure and function. So we are going to explore levels of organization in an organism, the structure and function of an animal cell, the structure and function of a plant cell, and we're also going to observe cells, tissues, and organ samples using a microscope today. While you're watching us do all of that, you can ask us questions, but since this is a virtual field trip, to ask us a question, you need to do it online, and the website to do that is www.tiny.cc/EEC-question-answer. You can ask us any question you like and as many questions as you like. We'll try to answer all of them during our time this morning. So without further ado, we're going to start today's field trip with Mr. Monroe.
Good morning, seventh graders. My part of your time with us today is on the topic of levels of organization in living things. You know, scientists consider the cell the basic unit of life. I've got a little friend that I'm going to get out. We're going to talk a little bit about him, and then we're going to learn about the different levels of organization in living things, in animals and plants. My little friend here, this is Hoppy the bullfrog. Now, it's really hard for me to imagine. I can't even figure out the number of cells that are in this organism. Now, we know that those cells make up different parts of him. Different organs are made up of cells. And we're going to go through that so that you guys can learn a little bit about the different levels. But the basic unit of life is considered to be the cell. Now, that's not the smallest unit because within that cell, there are organelles. Okay? So let's get started. Cells basically are organized into tissues. Tissues are organized into organs. Organs are then organized into different systems within that multicellular organism. And then the systems that are put together are then forming the organism. Now we know that groups of cells that perform a similar function is known as tissue. Now, tissue comes in, there are four major types of tissue. In fact, the one that is exposed to the environment most of the time is called the epithelial. And that is an outer covering. And even internally, it is a covering on cavities, glands, the skin, the mucous membrane. And you know what? This is one type of cell that goes through a continual loss and replacement. And again, it comes in direct contact with the environment. The next type of tissue that's made up of special cells would be what we call the connective tissue. That's bone, cartilage, and blood. Okay? And there would be specific cells that would make up that tissue because of the job that it's doing. The next type of tissue and type of cells would be part of what we call nervous tissue. And within the nervous tissue, you're going to find cells that actually receive electrical signals from one another called neurons. They even pass on these electrical signals to target cells, which are found in the muscles, glands, and other organs that are in the body. And the last one is the muscular tissue. Protein fibers allow for these cells to contract. Some well-known organs that are filled with these, with well-known tissue that are filled with these cells are skeletal tissue, muscle tissue, smooth muscle tissue, and cardiac muscle. And you know, there is a direct order for the organization of these cells and tissues. It starts with the very beginning, or the smallest part, which is the cell. And within the cell, there are organelles. From the cell, we go into the different tissues, depending on what those tissues do and how that cell fits in. And then from the tissue, we go into the different organs. For example, if we look at the inside of this frog here, you know, at one time, students got all excited because they had a chance to dissect a frog and cut a frog up to look for certain tissues. But if you look inside there, there are a variety of organs. We know that the heart deals with the circulatory system. Now, that heart would be the type of organ that would use muscular tissue because the heart is actually a muscle. The lung would be part of the system that we call the respiratory system. It deals with the breathing part. And of course, that lung probably uses some of a little bit of all of the different tissues. Okay, now, cells, tissue, organs, organ systems, and once the organ systems are there, then we have the organism itself. You know, yesterday I was teaching this lesson and I likened the order that that level appears, or that that organization put together, was like a great big archery target with the center bullseye, the next ring, the next ring, the next ring. The bullseye actually would be the starting point. Cells and organelles. The next ring would be tissue. The next ring would be the organs. And then the next ring would be the organ system. And then the outer ring would be the organism itself. You know, I've got another little animal here. And of course, its diagram is up there again. Let me get him out. And this is a red ear slider. And of course, we have a diagram up here on the wetboard of a red ear slider. Now, deep inside this red ear slider, he has a stomach. Now, we can find several types of tissue in this red ear slider stomach. We can find linings in the stomach, which would be the epithelial, and we also would find muscles in the stomach, which would fall under what we call connective tissue. So there you see the tissue makes the organ, and guess what? Cells make the tissue, and then the organ falls into the system that is doing a function, and then we have the organism itself. Now, when we talk about plants, a plant's body has a hierarchy of organs, tissues, and cells like multicellular animals. Basic organs for most plants, or a lot of plants, would be the roots, the stems, and the leaves. And by the same token, like a multicellular animal, it would start out with the cells. The cells would fit into a special tissue, and then the tissue would make the organs. And then the organs would make the organ system, and then we would have the organism itself. Hopefully, I've been able to help you understand the different levels of organization in living things. And if you have any questions, I'm now going to pass it on to Mr. Broughton so he can answer those for you. All right, Mr. Broughton.
Thank you, Mr. Monroe. And we did have one question, which is, can I see that target? And yes, you can see that target. So let me share my screen with you, and I'll pull it up. There we go. And there it is. So you can see that at the center would be the smallest unit or level of organization, which is the cell. And then a cell contains cell organelles that you're going to see here in just a minute. Just outside that would be a tissue, because a tissue is made up of cells. then an organ, because an organ is made up of tissues, then the organ system, and then finally the entire organism. So that could be a human or a frog or any living organism that there is, a plant as well. But that's the levels of organization. All right, we're going to take a look at an organism through a microscope now with Ms. Ramirez.
Hello, 7th grade. My name is Ms. Ramirez, and you'll be seeing me throughout the presentation with some microscope slides. So the science tool that I'll be using today is called a monocular compound microscope. And monocular just means that my microscope today just has one eyepiece or one ocular. So let me show you what it looks like, and we'll just go over briefly some of the parts before I show you some slides. So this is the compound microscope. You see it has 3 objectives. There's a low power, a high power, and a medium power objective. We have this part right here, which is the arm, and the base is simply the big piece on the bottom. We also have our coarse focus knob and then our fine focus knob. And then we have an illuminator down here that provides light so that we can see the slides. So the first organism that I'm going to show you today, we're going to look at the whole organism, and this whole organism is Daphnia. It is in kingdom Animalia, so it is an animal, and it is a multicellular organism. It is also called the water flea because these organisms are aquatic. So they live in a lot of our freshwater ponds and lakes, and when you see them swimming, they dart around erratically. It sort of looks like they're jumping, and so that's why they call them water flea. So I'm going to go ahead and switch my screen, and I'm going to show you a slide of our Daphnia. So just bear with me as I switch my camera. So here is the Daphnia. Now this Daphnia is not alive, but if you want to see something cool, you can check online and look for videos of live Daphnia in the pond so that you can see how they move. See if you can identify any organs. What are some things that you see or observe in this slide? I'll give you a few seconds to make some observations, and then I'm going to actually show you the anatomy of a Daphnia. So let me just show you what you were looking at. So here is the Daphnia. In just a little bit, I'm going to show you the slide again, and I want to see if you can find some of these organs. So an organ is just made out of a group of 2 or more tissues. So here's the heart. It is an organ that is part of the circulatory system. This is the brood chamber with embryos, and it's part of the reproductive system. This big spot here is the compound eye, and the eye is part of the nervous system. Then we have this long piece here. This is sort of like the stomach or the gut. Those organs are part of the digestive system. And then we have these filaments here. These are just thoracic appendages. They're like little arms. So see if you can remember some of these organs. And I'm going to show you the slide again, and we'll see if you can identify any of them. So let's start with this. What do y'all think that is? So this is the compound eye. Again, the eye is an organ, and it's part of the nervous system. What about these? So these are, they make up the brood chamber, and these are the embryos for this Daphnia. And again, these represent the reproductive system. Can you guys make out the stomach or the gut? That is part of the digestive system. It's this yellow tract here, this yellow line. So it extends from the mouth all the way toward the end, toward the anus. Oops, my phone died. There it goes. So this is Daphnia. Now, Daphnia is an organism, and it is made out of organs, organ systems, but what we're not seeing are the tissues in the cells. So I'm going to switch our microscope, and we're going to look at an example of animal cells. So what are some things that you see or notice? Let me see if I can get it in focus. So you might see what looks like light pink circles. Those are the cells. What do you think these dark purple circles are inside those pink circles? Those smaller dark circles are the nucleus of the animal cell. Now, do you think there are other things inside the cell other than the nucleus? There are. There's other organelles that we can't see on this microscope slide because my microscope doesn't have a high power magnification. And Mrs. Fuller is going to come on next, and she's going to talk to you about some of those other organelles that are present in an animal cell. And I'm going to pass it over to Mrs. Fuller so that she can show you a model of the other organelles that are in an animal cell.
Good morning, students. We're going to talk about the animal cell today. Before we start talking about that, we're going to talk for a second about cell theory, which is a fundamental concept in biology. In 1838, there was a German scientist by the name of Matthias Schleiden, and he came up with the idea that all plants are made of cells. And a year later, another German biologist by the name of Theodor Schwann, he came up with the idea that all animals are made of cells. And then in 1855, still another German biologist, his name was Rudolf Virchow, he came up with the idea that all new cells come from existing cells. So they took these, took the work of these three German biologists plus work from other biologists, put it together to form the idea of cell theory. And cell theory is very simple. It just simply states that all living things are made of cells. It says that the cells are the basic structure and function of all living things, and new cells are produced from existing cells. So that's cell theory for you. Now here's an animal cell. It's got a cell membrane around the outside, which it controls what comes in and goes out from the cell. It also provides support and protection. Now we're going to look at some of the organelles. The word organelle simply means little organ. So we're going to look at the organelles within the animal cell. So the first one we're going to look at is the nucleus. That's this big purple thing right here, the whole thing. And it's got an envelope on the outside of it that's covered in pores, like the pores on our skin. And it allows things to enter and exit the nucleus. Now, the nucleus is made primarily of something called chromatin, and that's sort of an unorganized type of DNA material. When the cell gets ready to undergo mitosis, when it's getting ready to split, this chromatin will organize into chromosomes. Now, you might notice this little thing looks like a purple ping pong ball right in here. That's the nucleolus. Now, the nucleolus produces ribosomes, and ribosomes produce proteins. So every part on the cell has its little job. And you see all this sort of aqua or sky blue material all throughout the cell. That's called cytoplasm. Now, one of the really, really neato organelles in the cell is called the mitochondrion. Right there, we've got quite a few represented. Some are cross sections like this one, and some of them you're seeing the outside of it. It's got 4 different things that we're going to talk about. It's got a nickname. It's called the powerhouse of the cell. It's where ATP is created. It's where cellular respiration goes on. But one thing that I think is really fascinating about the mitochondrion is it's a symbiont, which means it didn't originally belong. It is actually a bacteria, a purple bacteria that over the millions of years ingratiated itself into the animal cell. And it's very, very important in the metabolism of the things that come into the cell. So that's one real interesting thing is it symbiont means it's in a symbiotic relationship with the rest of the cell. Sym means with and bio means life. So And the fourth thing has to do with DNA. If you've ever sent money off to 123Me and Me or Ancestry.com, if you're a guy, they'll test your Y chromosome DNA, but if you're a girl, you don't have a Y chromosome. So what they'll test is your mitochondrion genetic material, the DNA from this, and it will strictly tell you about your mother and your mother's mother and your mother's mother's mother and so on, because the material that the mitochondrion comes from is from the cytoplasm of the ovum of the egg. And of course, the egg just comes from the mother. So this can tell you about your maternal heritage or your maternal lineage. So that's a very interesting thing. Let's see, where are we going from here? Oh, the Golgi apparatus. You see this red stuff up here? That's the Golgi apparatus, and it's kind of like a shipping and receiving at a company. It's responsible for modifying material and transporting material, and puts the lipids and the proteins into little vesicles for it to be moved to specific places. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is this little yellow dot right here. That's a lysosome, and it's kind of like a cleanup crew. If there's an organelle that's got some old pieces that need to be disposed of, the lysosome will take care of that. And the way I remember that is it reminds me of the product called Lysol that we clean things with. So the lysosome is like our a cleanup crew, and it does some other things as well. It's even though it's tiny little organelle, it does some interesting things. Now, the next thing, we've got two kinds of endoplasmic reticulum. This kind over here is called rough, and this kind over here is called smooth. This is called rough because it's got ribosomes stuck all over the outside of it. You can't tell it by looking at it through the camera, but I can feel it with my fingers. And it's got this rough texture because it's got a lot of ribosomes stuck to it, and it forms proteins. Now, the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, it's responsible for making hormones and lipids, I believe lipids. Yeah. And hormones and lipids and liver cells. You know, the liver, when you study the body systems, the liver is responsible for detoxifying the body, for getting toxins out of the body. So it has a whole lot of smooth endoplasmic reticulum in the liver cells. So it can make these hormones for it, and all lipids are fats. Okay, and the last one I think we're going to talk about is this little yellow thing protruding through here. That's the centriole, and it has sort of an interesting job. It helps locate or fix within the cell the nucleus. So it's sort of a structural type of function for these little guys. But anyway, the cell is fascinating, and I hope you enjoy studying it this year. We're going to turn it over back to Mr. Broughton. If you have any questions about the animal cell, he'd be glad to help you with that. Have a delightful day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mrs. Fuller. And we did get one question, which is how big is an animal cell? So I'm going to share my screen again because I've got a website that I think helps visualize that. There we go. This website is scaleofuniverse.com if you ever want to visit it yourself. And what we've got here is a picture that shows, like, this circle represents 1 meter in diameter across. Or here's a human being is a little taller than a meter. But if I start moving my slider to the left, we're going to kind of go in and look at smaller and smaller things. So there's a square inch now, an ant, And if we keep going here, you can see a skin cell, which is an animal cell. There's a red blood cell, a white blood cell. I'm going to zoom in a little bit further here. You can see a mitochondrion. That's one of the cell organelles. And and it's about 10 to the negative 5 or so power, which would be about, I would estimate like a cell like this would be about 500 thousandths of a meter. So very small. That's, of course, why we use a microscope to look at them. All right, let's move on to plants with Mr. Ramirez again.
Okay, I'm back again. In this segment, we're going to be looking at a plant organism and then also plant cells. So the actual organism that we're going to be looking at is this organism right here. This is Elodea. So I have a wilted one that I didn't put in water, and then I have one that I kept in water. So Elodea is an aquatic plant. So it is in Kingdom Plantae. It is a plant. And we're going to be looking at a slide of leaf tissue. So the leaf tissue, when I put it under the microscope, you'll be able to see the individual cells that make up the tissue section of the leaf. And a leaf is an organ for the plant. So if we look at our actual organism here, you can actually see some organs. The leaf is an organ and the stem is an organ. The leaf and the stem make up the organ system called the shoot system. So yes, plants have organs just like humans do. We might have different ones, but they still have organs. So think about what are the functions of some of the organs that plants have. So let me show you what Elodea leaf tissue looks like. So I'm going to switch my screen again. So this is the Elodea leaf tissue. What are some things that you observe, and what do you think they are? So what do you think these things right here are? And what do you think these dots are? So what you're looking at, these are the individual cells that are making up this leaf tissue. So if I tell you that these are the cells, then what do you think these big dots are? Those big dots are the nucleus of the cell. So something interesting, the term cell was first used by a scientist named Robert Hooke, and he was the first one to term the word cell. He used that term to describe these because he was looking at a piece of cork under a microscope, and he saw something very similar to what you're seeing here. The word cell comes from the Latin word for cella, which means a small room. So if you look at these little individual pieces, do they kind of look like small rooms to you? So that's what Robert Hooke thought, and that's why he coined these structures a cell. The next thing I want to show you guys really quick, if we look over here, we see that this Elodea wilted. I left it out of water, and since these are aquatic plants, they really need that water. Now compare what this one looks like, the wilted one, to the one that looks like in the water. What organelle do you think is responsible for water storage? And I'm just going to go over briefly with you because Ms. Nash is actually going to talk to you about some of these other organs. That is the vacuole. So if we look at our little diagram here, our wilted Elodea looks like the image over here. So the Elodea for our wilted one, the cell, its vacuole is kind of small and squished. It doesn't have a lot of water in it, and that's why the leaves look wilted. The Elodea that was in the water looks nice and plush and green because its vacuole is filled with lots of water. So the vacuole is an important organelle for water storage. If the plant cells have an adequate supply of water, we call them turgid. So they look nice, the whole organism looks nice and pretty. If the vacuole doesn't have enough water storage, the cell itself is going to look kind of small and shriveled, and that's going to make the entire organism look kind of wilted. And I'm going to pass it over to Miss Nash, and she's going to go over more in depth some of the organelles that are inside a cell. Now remember, because my microscope doesn't have a high power magnification, we were only able to see the nucleus in our plant cell, but there are lots of other organelles that we couldn't see. So Miss Nash is going to go ahead and take it over, and she's going to talk about the plant cell.
Hello, so here we are in the garden with a sadly wilted plant here. So as Miss Ramirez was saying, that vacuole doesn't have any water in it anymore and just collapsed. So here we are in the garden to talk about plants and plant cells. And you may hear some hummingbirds flitting around, making a lot of noise. They're kind of fighting right now. They're migrating. It's a great time of year to observe them. Let's look at our plant cell model here. And as Mr. Fuller was telling you, there are a lot of the same organelles exist in plants and animals, but like the endoplasmic reticulum, the nucleus, the mitochondria, the ribosomes, okay. But there's some unique features. And you look at that vacuole, and it can fill up almost the whole space in the cell. And that's what keeps it up, okay? But another really important part of the plant cell that animal cells don't have is a cell wall. And this is what allows plants to be rigid, okay? So that cell wall is made of cellulose and also a really amazing substance called lignin. And lignin is what allows plants to get enormous, giant trees, okay, that in the wind are like this. How can they do that? How come they don't break and fall over? Well, sometimes they do, but 100 miles an hour wind. But normally, in regular wind, they just kind of go with the wind. The lignin, incredibly strong. Imagine how heavy those big branches are, and yet they can hold them up. Pretty amazing. Now, another thing that's really important for plants, and it's unique to plants, and we can thank them for this because this is what makes life possible on the planet, is this one right here. These are the chloroplasts. And chloroplasts are the site of photosynthesis. Do I have another poster here? Look at on research. Next one. So photosynthesis just means made with light. Photo meaning light, synthesis being made. And they use energy from sunlight, CO2 from the air, and water that they suck up with their roots. And with those three things, that's all three things, they can make energy. They make their own energy, sugars and glucose, starches, for them to grow. And then we come along and we eat them. Okay, we animals, like this caterpillar was busy eating. Okay, see how he ate all those holes. Okay. So then who ate the caterpillar? Maybe a bird, and maybe a bobcat might eat the bird. So this is where it all starts, right here in the plant cell with the chloroplast, chlorophyll. It has chlorophyll. It gives it that green color. Gives it that green color. Yeah. Now, they also have specialized cells. So you looked at the Elodea leaf. Here's one from a bur oak. And leaves are really thin. Okay, so really there's not many layers of cells in that leaf. But when we look at it, we can think about what's it doing. So sunlight is going to hit the top of it. And it's darker green because it helps to absorb more sunlight. The underside is a little bit lighter green because the sun's not going to hit there. And as a result, if you look at a cross-section of a plant leaf, we can look at different cells. So the top has an epidermis, like skin, like we have. And then lined up in here are cells that have lots and lots of chloroplasts, because that's where the sun is going to be hitting. Then others in here with less chlorophyll. And then at the bottom, something really interesting. another layer of epithelial like skin. But then right here, these guard cells that actually open and close what's called the stomata. And that's where they're taking in, on this underside, the gases from the air. They're taking in air using the carbon dioxide and then giving off oxygen through that little pore called the stomata. It's a waste product. So oxygen is a byproduct of photosynthesis. And it's interesting, you can kind of tell, even just by feeling or looking with a hand lens at the leaf, about the different functions of those cells. It's kind of fuzzy under here. In Texas, we have a lot of drought. And one of our challenges for plants is don't wilt, okay? Don't look like that. So this fuzziness kind of helps it keep them from drying out so much. And you can also see another part of the system is the circulatory system. Okay, so the veins, the lines here, that's where the water can move up to all parts of the leaf, okay, out to the tiniest ends of the leaf. Okay. And then as the sugars are made, it goes back out to the rest of the plant to help it grow and stay alive. Now this time of year, we hear those hummingbirds. Here's another really good example of specialized cells. This is the reproduction for plants. Right? The flower, it's red, not green, because it's attracting the hummingbirds. They see red, and they're migrating, and this plant blooms right now, ready for the hummingbird. And you can see here the stigma at the end, the pollen here on the sides. Really, really interesting. So these are specialized cells for reproduction. That therefore it falls over. Okay, so I want you to just enjoy your plants, take a deep breath. Thank your plants for all the food you supply, for the lovely oxygen cleaning our air and giving us beauty and supporting all those hummingbirds on their way to Mexico. So thank you. And I'm going to turn it over to you, back to Ms. Ramirez. Okay.
Okay, it's my last observation for you guys. In this last segment, we're going to be looking at an organism called Volvox. It is a unicellular green algae. So this is very interesting because Volvox will form colonies. And I'm going to show you an image of Volvox. So I'm going to switch my computer camera. And here is Volvox. So what are some things that you see? Can you describe what you're seeing? Can you identify any structural parts? So this right here, the big circle itself is not a cell. The big circle is what we call a parent colony. And this parent colony is made up of anywhere between 500 and 500,000 individual Volvox cells. So Volvox is unique because it forms large colonies. So if this is the parent colony, what do you think these bigger purple dots are? These bigger purple dots are called daughter colonies, and they are also made out of hundreds or thousands of individual cells. What ends up happening is when this parent colony matures and gets old, it will eventually die and disintegrate. When it disintegrates, these little daughter colonies will emerge out and they will then form their own parent colonies. Volvox is very unique. Now, again, my microscope doesn't have the magnification ability to be able to show you what an individual cell looks like. So I'm going to show you an image of what the individual Volvox cell looks like. So again, this is just a colony of Volvox cells. Let me show you a picture of the individual one. So this is the individual Volvox cell. And what are some things that you see? And what are their functions? So if this is the individual cell, we see right here the chloroplast. Did animals or plants have a chloroplast? Do y'all remember? So plants have chloroplast, and that's where the pigment chlorophyll is to aid in photosynthesis. So green algae or Volvox is a photosynthetic organism. It also has a nucleus. It also has a vacuole. Now, the different thing about Volvox is it has flagella, and typically plant cells won't have flagella. So scientists kind of call Volvox kind of like a misfit. It's not quite a plant and it's not quite an animal. It has characteristics of both plant and animal kingdoms. So just like a plant cell, it has chloroplast, but just like some animal cells, it has a flagella to aid in movement. So scientists are kind of in a debate about where to place Volvox. Most scientists will place it in kingdom Protista, and that's where a lot of our other misfit organisms are. And then some scientists still place it with kingdom Plantae because it is very much more plant-like than it is animal-like. And you saw the cell of Volvox, and you saw the colony. When you have billions of colonies of Volvox, this is what it looks like outside. Now, Volvox is a freshwater algae. We have it out here, and this is what all these colonies are right here. So that it would be the actual mass of all these colonies here. So to review, we're going to move over to our anchor chart just to review some words before I let you guys go. We talked about the levels of organization. We learned that the cell is the smallest unit. Then we talked about tissues. Tissues are just a group of similar cells that perform common functions. Then we talked about organs. Organs are just a group of two or more tissues. So for example, a lung would be an organ. Multiple organs that perform a common function will come together to join and create an organ system. So examples of organ systems would be like the respiratory system, which we have here. We also have the digestive system, the circulatory system. And then once you have all of these together, they create an organism. And an organism is just a living thing that can carry out life processes by itself. Now, we observed all of these levels when we were looking at some of our microscope slides. So let's review our Elodea. We saw an Elodea cell. We saw the Elodea nucleus. There were other organelles inside Elodea that we couldn't see with the microscope, so I didn't put them in my drawing. But just remember that there are lots of other plant organelles. We just weren't able to see them with the microscope. So we have the Elodea cell. We saw the collection of cells. When we saw the leaf tissue, we saw all those cells together. I showed you the Elodea leaf. The leaf would be the organ. And again, the leaf is made out of the leaf tissue. I showed you guys the Elodea with the stem and the leaves. The stem and the leaves are organs that make up the organ system called the shoot system. And then the whole Elodea organism would include the stem, the leaves, and the roots. And that all of these together, all of these levels together create the Elodea organism. So before I hand it over for questions, I have a challenge for you guys. I want to see if you can find an organism that is a plant, identify some of its organs, describe what the function is of those organs, and tell us what organ system does it belong to. The second thing I want you to do is to find an organism that is an animal. Identify some of its organs, describe the function of those organs, and then identify what organ system does it belong to. And now I'm going to hand it back to Mr. Broughton, and he's going to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Ramirez. And the question I got was someone wanted to know more about that number that was in the lower right-hand corner of the website I shared. So I'm going to share my screen again so you can see that. There we go. And I think they were talking about this. This is scientific notation. So when you're dealing with an object or a distance that is very, very small or very, very large, sometimes it's easier to write the number using scientific notation so you don't have to put so many zeros on the paper. So if I keep going this way to get smaller and smaller things, you'll see that number is going more and more negative because we're getting to a strand of DNA. If I drag it the other way, It'll eventually get back to 0 where that human was. And then if I keep going, you'll see that exponent increasing because we're getting to larger and larger things like planets even. So how that works is like take the size of a plant cell. If you wrote it out without using scientific notation, it would be 0.0000085 meters. Or another way to say that would be 85 hundredth thousandths of a meter. That's a lot of zeros. So written in scientific notation, you can just do 8.5 times 10 to the negative 5 meters. And why they put a negative 5 is because we're going to move that decimal point to the right 5 spaces. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There would be 8.5 and then times 10 to the negative 5 meters. Or another example is suppose a Volvox colony has 30,000 cells. 30,000 written in scientific notation would be 3 times 10 to the 4th power, or 10 to the 4. So that decimal point would have been right here. And if we go to the left, 1, 2, 3, 4 to get 3.0, it then becomes 3 times 10 to the 4th power. All right, let's review what we did this afternoon. During this virtual field trip, you discovered that living systems at all levels of organization demonstrate the complementary nature of structure and function. We explored levels of organization in an organism. We looked at the structure and function of an animal cell, the structure and function of a plant cell, and you observed cells, tissues, and organ samples using Mr. Meares' microscope. So thank you so much for joining us this morning. We would like feedback from you on how we did today, and you can give us that feedback by going to www.tiny.cc/EEC-feedback to let us know what you thought about today's trip. We use that information to improve what we do, so we'd really appreciate your feedback. Thank you very much, and have a great rest of your morning.